You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network. This is Talking Headways, a weekly podcast about sustainable transportation and urban design. I'm Jeff Wood. This week we're chatting with Anthony Townsend about his book, Ghost Road, Beyond the Driverless Car. We talk about the potential scary future financialization of transportation could create, how the pandemic has shot delivery automation into the future, and much, much more. Stay with us. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Overhead Wire Media's production of Raymond Unwin's Town Planning in Practice. If you want to purchase our recent audiobook production of this 1909 classic, go to raymondunwin.com and click on the link to Awsound. There you can download it as a podcast series where each chapter is a new episode. You can also get it wherever audiobooks are sold. Today's podcast is also brought to you by our super generous Patreon supporters. Thanks so much to those that listen and support each month. We really appreciate it. And now, if you'd like to get a hold of our bus-only soccer-style scarf with dedicated lane designs, donate $10 or more a month on Patreon and we'll send one along. We also really appreciate the $1 or $2 a month support. So if you'd like to sign up and keep us going, go to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. That's patreon.com/theoverheadwire. You can also purchase the scarf by going to theoverheadwire.com. And I would be remiss if we didn't mention the Overhead Wire newsletter. We've been doing it for 14 years, and I hope to be doing it for 14 more. We're now at 67,000 links tagged by topic and city for subscribers. Sign up today for a 2-week trial by going to theoverheadwire.com. Before we get to this week's show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast wherever you find your podcasts, including iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And subscribing means you get both this show, Talking Headways, and Mondays at the Overhead Wire, where this music I'm talking about comes from, on the same feed. 2 fun podcasts, 1 great channel. Subscribe today. Well, Anthony Townsend, welcome to the Talking Headways podcast.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So before we get started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am now the urbanist in residence at Cornell Tech, which is the newest engineering school in New York City, opened, I think, 8 years ago. And this year has launched the 3rd of its hubs. We don't have departments that's focusing on urban tech. And I came aboard in the midst of this pandemic. I'm actually in residence at my own residence, not at the campus, which is closed. We're doing all virtual instruction this semester. So it's super weird, but yeah, we're really just trying to understand, how all these technologies can be leveraged, not just, deal with the immediate crises facing cities, but also the long-term recovery as we climb out of the hole we've dug ourselves into. But yeah, that's kind of my world now, back in academia. I spent most of the last 10 years writing and consulting, a lot of work with philanthropies, corporations, governments, helping them, mostly look at long-term trends and scenarios around technological change in cities.
How'd you get into the nexus between technology and cities?
So I originally started out working in the ISP industry in the mid-90s. My first job out of undergrad was working for AT&T's WorldNet service, which was their dial-up ISP service that they started in the mid-90s. And, I ended up pulling the graveyard shift one month, and I would spend my nights looking up at this giant map of AT&T's global frame relay network. It was like the network operations map. And if you remember the war room from War Games, that's kind of what it looked like. And I was just fascinated by the geography of these networks and the fact that, it seemed to follow the old networks. And I wanted to understand why that was. And that led me down the road of studying telecommunications infrastructure, which traditionally has just been really neglected in urban planning for a whole bunch of reasons. But, the timing was right to really try to understand it because it was going to become so important in the decades that have followed.
All this stuff going on with the FCC rulings must be interesting to you at this point as well, I imagine.
Which ones in particular?
Well, basically, Ajit Pai is kind of trying to limit the amount of charges that cities can put on telecommunications companies for putting up infrastructure and things like that. It's just been fascinating to watch all that stuff kind of happen and the back and forth between cities and the telecom companies.
Oh, around the 5G deployment.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that has built up over the years, and just because of the physics of 5G and the demand for wireless data, the networks now are much more fine-grained, and there's more antennas, they're closer to the ground, they're more visible, and the backlash is more pronounced. And I think all the other things that the tech industry has done to, raise people's hackles. I'm looking at you, Mark Zuckerberg.
He's right around the corner here.
Has really given people, just a heightened sensitivity to this. There are some valid questions about it. And the telecom industry, they're masters at the game of lobbying. And so, they've intervened at the state level where all the rules are set and have been set for the last 125 years. And cities have very little freedom in the US to maneuver, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, the book is called Ghost Road, Beyond the Driverless Car. What got you to write it?
So I had the opportunity starting in 2017 to work with Bloomberg Philanthropies on their joint project with the Aspen Institute's Center for Urban Innovation. It was an initiative on cities and autonomous vehicles. And around that time, Mike Bloomberg, I think, had been tipped off to the rapid advances that were going on in self-driving vehicles and potentially some of the risks that might pose for the progressive moves that we were making around transportation and mobility. And that in many ways, there was a risk of big tech companies, like Google, and new car companies like Tesla, and then the old car companies kind of reasserting a 20th century perfected version of car-based mobility on cities. And so those two organizations brought together a group of 10 cities for about 18 months through a series of workshops to talk about what their interest was. And I was brought in to research and present a series of reports and forecasts, helping understand what is the future for these technologies and what could it be if we tried to steer it more in the interest of an urban agenda. And when I got done with that, I realized that it was really important to translate that into a format that could be, pushed out to a bigger and broader audience, because this really is a historic shift in the technological basis for urban mobility. And it goes way, way beyond just automobiles. And in fact, I think, if the book says nothing else, it says that, which is focusing on the driverless car is really, a red herring. And it's all the other things that move. They're going to benefit from automation in the short term. And that if properly harnessed, that's actually a really, really good thing for cities. We can create vehicles that are able to fit into the built environments and the visions that we have for those built environments much more smoothly and in much more carefully crafted ways than automobiles, which were greedy and dangerous and sort of took the space and never gave it back.
Well, yeah, you talk about many other things than just passenger vehicles. You have 3 topics in the book: specialization, materialization, financialization. I'm curious which one was your favorite to write about.
I mean, there's favorite and there's most important.
That's a good distinction.
The specialization is the favorite. I talk about this in the book. And Brian Boyer, who was my collaborator on a lot of the research for Bloomberg Philanthropies, and actually his firm Dash Marshall, which is based in Detroit, right in the heart of the kind of historical home of the auto industry, did all the illustrations for the book. He, last year with his students at the University of Michigan, they went on to do a robot census where they cataloged more than 80 different commercially available self-driving vehicles that are not, passenger cars, that are on the market. And they're mostly super specialized things like forklifts. And there's a Finnish company that just released essentially what's like a self-driving Roomba for streets.
I saw that yesterday.
It's a street cleaner. Yeah. I mean, so these things are coming, and the first big, real commercial self-driving vehicles were trucks that were, used for the big mines in Australia, and John Deere's self-driving tractor. There's kind of a, childish fascination with all the things that go vroom and honk when you start to look at these catalogs of all the different kinds of vehicles. And then when you start to add the robots in, which is also advancing, very quickly, and realize just how quickly the line blurs between what's a robot, what's a vehicle, what's made for an indoor environment, what's made for outdoor, urban environment. It's just really kind of exciting, particularly when you realize that it represents a pretty thorough and permanent unbundling of the automobile. And it's the bundling of the automobile that has been the thing that has caused us so much hassle, over the decades. And there isn't a day, even an hour that goes by that I don't get one of those pictures in my Twitter feed showing, here's how many people a lane can carry when people are on bikes. Here's on buses, here's in cars.
Yeah.
Well, breaking down that box into smaller vehicles and different kinds of vehicles is really the fundamental promise of automated mobility. The most important story of the book is the financialization story. And I think I really just scratched the surface on it. It was more of a warning bell or a red flag, trying to understand, what's the worst that can happen if we allow private capital and deregulation to do to urban transportation, what it has done to energy and electricity in particular, or food commodities like grain and things like that, or the housing finance market. It becomes a thing that, to a large degree, is no longer about the services being delivered, but the tail of finance is wagging the dog, and you have this whole corpus of financial instruments and obligations that are built up on top of it, and the flows of revenue that come off of it, and that happening in an environment where there's really a handful of players who control the networks and control the computation that's going to be used to organize it all. And the nightmare scenarios there are there's a lot of them, but what if we get an Enron-like player, say in the ride-hail business, who starts withholding mobility when it's in their financial interest to do it, in the same way that Enron was withholding electricity from California during heat waves to spike the price and juice their margins. Do we want to live in a world where nothing moves, like literally nothing moves, unless Amazon or Google gets a piece of the action? There are a lot of plays out there and a lot of technological platforms being deployed that are moving us towards that kind of world. A lot of business strategies as well. And, I looked back in history at the transition from horse-drawn streetcars to electric streetcars. And while, it's by no means a perfect comparison, the shift in capital requirements that came along with that, you went from entrepreneurs being able to pool family funds and get into the business with, a single vehicle and an animal, to really having to raise funds to build a rail network and generating facility and a power line network. And that created the conditions for really kind of cozy, corrupt relationships with political powers. And especially as we move into this deep, deep fiscal crisis for cities, you can start to see some very, very dangerous alignments of fiscal desperation on the one hand by city governments, and very, very deep-pocketed mobility monopolists who can buy their way in, either providing lump sum payments for franchises or all kinds of revenue shares, monetizing public assets in other ways, in ways that are going to be hard to get out of and potentially really detrimental to the public interest, or will make it harder to do things like expand mobility to underserved groups. And so that, to me, the more I thought about it, I almost had to stop thinking about it, because it started to, one, I kind of reached the limits of my expertise. But every time I talked, I live in the New York City area, and every time I would talk to friends of mine who work in finance, after they stopped getting really excited about it and realized that I was talking about it because I thought it was horrifying, they would basically say, yeah, that's really plausible. Like, either people are already sniffing that opportunity, or yes, that's a likely direction that people will want to go after if given the opportunity. And so the reason I wrote about that was because I didn't want to write about safety. Like, I could care less about the safety of automated vehicles. They're either going to be safe or they're not.
You called it a red herring.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much attention on it. Like, the one thing that at least the automotive transportation does well is regulate vehicle safety. People don't die in crashes because the vehicles are unsafe. They die because, the drivers are bad at driving, or they're breaking the law, right? So I think we only have gains there to come. I think understanding the relationship between markets, new mobility services, and automated systems is really where the danger zone is going to be.
There's so much in there I want to unpack.
Yeah.
The first thing when you started talking about like kind of agribusiness, I was thinking of transportation as kind of the high fructose corn syrup of and corn subsidies and all that stuff. But I also want to talk about, you had a discussion also about congestion pricing, and I'm wondering if there's that. And then there's also the Chicago use of parking meters downtown, where they sold off, a number of of assets to get a lump sum, like you said, and then it's already paid off for the company that purchased it, and now they're going to have like 60 years or something of profits, which is ridiculous to give away such an asset, but also to allow somebody to prey on the city like that. But I'm just wondering if, you think congestion pricing and some of these other mechanisms are a gateway drug.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of how I described it in the book. And I was really, that was a sensational framing to get people's attention. I think congestion pricing is a good idea for all the reasons that I think many people support it. We have to fairly price roads, right? And a lot of roads are underpriced now, and there's all kinds of bad reasons for that, and it leads to all kinds of bad outcomes. What I was trying to paint in the book was a picture of sort of regulatory capture of a congestion pricing system by a bad mobility monopolist. And, this is something that I actually first got the idea from The Economist. There was a column, I think around 2017, that was exploring this possibility. And the more I sat with it, the more it started to make sense to me. Because what's happening, particularly with SoftBank and Uber, and the kind of maneuverings that Masayoshi Son, the chairman of SoftBank, has been making, is that they've systematically been pulling, as they've acquired more and more of the ride-hail companies around the world, systematically pulling them out of markets where they're in competition with each other. So in Singapore, as soon as the Uber-Grab merger was executed, Uber was pulled out. Grab more or less consolidated like an 85% market share, and the fares went up pretty swiftly, pretty significantly. And Singapore, which is not a country of ineffective government, levied what was, I think, the greatest, anti-competitive fine in the country's history of something like $18 million, if I recall. And, this was like a rounding error for Grab there. And so, it was a slap on the wrist. And, to this day, they still operate with a near monopoly in Singapore. So if you think about the kind of power that a company like that can wield, when they essentially manage both the supply and the demand, that through pricing, they can generate more ride requests at any time of day in any district of the city that they want to. And then they can adjust the compensation. They can adjust the routing of vehicles to create the supply to meet it. So imagine this happening in New York City or San Francisco 5 years from now, where, Lyft is gone. Uber's the only one left. Most of the traffic in the central business district, especially at the times when the really high dynamic congestion prices kick in, is ride-hail vehicles. That puts that operator in an incredible negotiating position because they're essentially the single payer of the congestion fee. And even if they aren't, in a competitive environment today, passing those congestion fees along to their riders. I mean, it's been pretty clear that in New York City, when we were moving towards congestion pricing pretty quickly last year, that Uber and Lyft were just going to have to suck it up. That once they get the monopoly, they'll just pass it on. So they're sort of becoming this gatekeeper of congestion toll revenue between riders and the city. Literally the ability to turn the tap on the congestion revenue or not. So, imagine they're not getting what they want from the city. They might start doing things like incentivizing passengers to get dropped off at the edge of the congestion cordon, or dropping people off at the edge of the congestion cordon and having them get picked up on the other side of the street, thereby having them walk across the cordon. I mean, there's so many different ways that they could game it. And like playing the game would just be a matter of code changes. And so it'd be a very difficult thing, I think, to keep up with. And so to me, I looked at that and said, this looks a lot like, the kind of relationship that existed back, in the days of the streetcar barons, where, there was this chaotic system. The cities were really desperate for private capital. Riders were sort of the ones footing the bill for it, and everybody else was lining their pockets. I think it would be very easy to build a congestion pricing system and a ride-hail regulation or whatever urban mobility regulation scheme to prevent that kind of outcome. But what I wanted to show is, again, here's the worst thing that could happen. And let's just assume, the worst intentions and the most amount of greed on the part of the mobility operators and the least competent response on the side of the city, and play that out. And, this, I think, seems like it would be the kind of natural endpoint of that.
So that's kind of the scary part. I promise most of the book is pretty fun. There are some interesting connections to the House of Sod and other, money related stuff, but
Yeah,
let's talk a bit about the fun stuff.
yeah, sure, sure.
The names for cruise control kind of made me laugh out loud. My favorite, I think, was Control-O-Matic. What was your favorite?
The Touch-O-Matic or the Speedostat was another good one.
How important is language in how we talk about all these issues, how we talk about this transportation?
Oh, it's huge. God, I mean, we live in a world, where we have alternative facts and so many different ways of kind of gaslighting people around what is and what isn't true. Looking at the language of self-driving technology, of driverless technology, and the one that I find the most offensive, the autonomous technology, because there's nothing autonomous about these machines. They're some of the most infrastructure dependent vehicles that have ever been invented. They listen to wireless transmissions from satellites overhead to orient themselves. They require connections to, you know, megabit per second low latency cellular networks, 5G networks, in order to download gigabytes of map data every second as you roll along. And in fact, they will kick themselves out of self-driving mode if they lose that connection. One of the most kind of surprising things I found when researching the book was when GM launched their Super Cruise feature for Cadillac, which is essentially, Cadillac's version of Tesla's autopilot. It comes with a coverage map because GM isn't, or GM's lawyers, I guess, aren't as bold as Tesla's lawyers. And they will only let you drive on roads that have been like extensively mapped and have really, really good broadband cellular coverage. And when they first launched that service, you would look at it and like there was one stretch of, I guess it's like, I want to say maybe I-10 going north out of Denver towards Laramie, Wyoming, just north of Boulder, where there's like a 10-mile stretch. And I know that road. I mean, it is straight as an arrow. There's like a 10-mile stretch coming out of Boulder where like the coverage ends for Super Cruise. And I was like reading it, I was kind of imagining, if you got up a good head of speed, you could probably hit that stretch of road, come off of Super Cruise, and never really know it before went along and cruised back into the next coverage. And the reason it's there is because there's very poor cellular service there, and GM won't let you cruise along without being able to grab the latest map and share all the telemetry. So I mean, then you get down to just like lane markings on the ground. Where I live in New Jersey, it's remarkable when they repaint the lane markings on the streets, and you're like, wow, this was like a 2-lane road, because we thought it was just like a 1-lane or kind of a free-for-all, but it was actually they repainted it. Autonomous vehicles depend on that. Unlike you and I, they can't figure out the environment. So I think the language is super important because it signals to us how we're supposed to be mobile, how we're supposed to move in the world, and our relationship to technology and the landscape. And, I think most of that language so far has been kind of weaponized for marketing, and not in ways that support like sustainable urban mobility vision going forward. They've been really kind of anti-human, anti-urban. And I think what I'm hoping is that we can start to think about, in the same way that like the evolution from say like cellular phone to mobile phone started to focus our attention not on like how the phone worked, but on what it provided for us, or the shift from like horseless carriage to automobile, from like what we were leaving behind to what we were gaining, like this autonomy, that we'll start to find words to really explain like what is the benefit, what is the positive vision of the future that this technology unlocks for us. And I don't know what the answer is for that yet, but I think we're sort of on the cusp now of leaving those words behind and finding some new ones.
You also talk about the history of the autonomous vehicle frenzy and the $80 billion that's been spent on R&D. Do you think we're wasting brainpower working on an AV solution that might never come?
No, I mean, I think this is better money spent than a lot of the other things that, the tech industry has spent money on, like precision targeting of advertising and whatnot. There are so many ancillary and spin-off uses of the systems that are being built and the core technologies. Autonomous driving has pushed deep learning really up against the wall. And there's a lot of kind of angst right now about whether it's really going to go any further. Have we reached the limits? Do new AI methods need to be employed, or what do we need to do? Do we need to now go back and look at instrumenting roads again? Again, getting back to the idea of autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
The whole pitch for autonomy 10 years ago was, we don't need government. We don't need infrastructure. We're just going to send these magic boxes out on the road, and they're going to retrofit everything, on their own with software. And then you go to someplace like Canada. Nobody in Canada talks about autonomous vehicles. It's always autonomous and connected vehicles, because they know that these things can't see in the snow. And they happen to be a country that's covered in snow half the year. So, Canada knows that this means upgrading the road infrastructure as well. So there's a lot of angst around that. But it's when you see things like Hitachi, the world's largest maker of electric wheelchairs, moving quickly, building a whole number of different automated wheelchair prototypes, and that Medicare and Medicaid have probably, paid for tens of millions of electric wheelchairs in the United States in the last decade. Over the next decade, they may buy automated wheelchairs. And, for all the sort of horrifying visions of like, oh, it's going to be like Wall-E, we're all going to be in, self-driving wheelchairs with screens in front of our faces. For senior citizens who, are isolated and don't have independence, that's a better way to live. I mean, we'll give them some independence, some mobility. And from like an urban mobility, sustainable urban mobility point of view, it would be better if they were doing it in a smaller vehicle, an electric vehicle that's lighter, and it's going to have a lower emission carbon footprint, that might be able to blend into a walkable neighborhood, than to have them, be getting picked up by a Tesla or a Waymo or another kind of self-driving full-size passenger vehicle. Seeing this technology getting pushed into scooters, like all of the kind of headaches of scooter and bike share networks, of rebalancing of discarded vehicles left around, of disinfecting vehicles between riders during a pandemic. These things will now be able to scoot themselves off to the depot to get disinfected, to get recharged, whatever needs to be done. They can predictively swarm around, areas where people are going to need them, whether it's a bar letting out or a concert or a train arriving at a station. And that's just going to provide so many new tools for urban designers and architects and planners to think about neighborhoods, right? If we don't have to think about how to get people to switch modes, like if the modes can actually go and make the pitch for people to switch modes by making themselves more convenient, by predicting activity patterns, like that's just a whole new set of tools. I think it is going to really challenge some of our assumptions about, say, what, things like walkability mean, how we think about how much retail we can use to anchor certain kinds of neighborhoods. I think our expectations are already changing around that very quickly. And that was actually the middle part of the book, the materialization part of the book. We've had way too much focus on how automation is going to affect passenger travel, when in fact it's freight vehicles that have far less risk and are getting a lot more investment and seeing a lot more applications actually come to market right now. The pandemic sort of shot us probably like 5 to 8 years into the future of shift from bricks and mortar to delivery. And you can see that whole industry just mobilizing. I mean, it's almost like a wartime mobilization to take the automation that has worked so well inside the warehouse, inside fulfillment centers, and push it out into the streets. And I think we're going to see that at an accelerating pace over the next couple of years. Amazon dropped $1 billion on Zoox this summer, Silicon Valley self-driving startup. Uber still has something going on around self-driving. Google will make a play in this at some point. And, there's tons and tons of stuff going on in China around this that is going to be really transformative, because the economics of automated delivery and retailing there are just completely different because of the density. So I think that to me is the area where I feel like cities are so flat-footed right now. They've historically spent very little of their transportation planning kind of mind space on freight. And it's really, really going to clobber them incredibly quickly. And what attention they do have on it is probably going to be focused on trying to prop up the retailers that survive the shakeout, as opposed to thinking about how do we deal with the influx of all this e-commerce that's coming in to fulfill the demand, that the bricks and mortar retailers have left behind as they've disappeared.
Yeah, it's been interesting to watch what's been going on, especially here in San Francisco, but also just kind of watching the news to see what these companies are doing. You saw a couple of weeks ago, Amazon decided to open up 1,000 kind of local stores closer to people so people could, I guess, go and pick up their packages or do whatever other number of things. While along a lot of streets here, there's a lot of retail that's disappearing. And I wonder, what that future holds necessarily because of this. And your observation that said we're kind of light speeding to 8 years ahead of time seems apt. I mean, it seems like people are getting pushed in decisions they were probably putting off.
Yeah. I mean, essentially what Amazon's doing is replicating UPS's footprint. So they're essentially building like a third, or, if you believe the post office is going to survive, like a fourth national parcel carrier. And they're going to withdraw, their business from the other ones that they use now, probably, and handle a lot of it themselves. But yeah, I mean, they're really looking to be able to fulfill the bulk of stuff that you want to buy within a couple of hours, and that's the biggest category killer like that ever existed. And so in many ways, I mean, I think it's almost better to have the pain of the shakeout all happen at once, because if cities, economic development can gear up to try to figure out how cities respond to this retail culling, they'll kind of deal with it now, and it'll be a big mobilization, and then they won't have to deal with it again, or the pain will all come at once, and it is going to be painful. But there are some precedents. I spent a lot of time in Singapore working with the government there, and Singapore's been planning a new central business district called the Jurong Lake District. And their forecast is that 2050, 65% of all retail purchases will happen online. And the idea is basically to build the district on top of a fulfillment center. So it's like the city's on top of, an Amazon warehouse. I think the idea is not to have that warehouse be owned by a single company. And for the US, that's the worst possible short-term outcome, is that Amazon essentially gets a monopoly on last mile distribution of goods. Because then, as we were talking about with Uber earlier, they become, the ferryman. Like, they get to control the flow of goods. They get to essentially levy a tax on anybody that wants access to that network. And they control the labor conditions. They generate the traffic. And, if cities try to somehow monetize access to the curb, which a lot of cities are interested in doing, and more will become so as the lack of relief starts to really bite in the next few months, Amazon's going to be in a really strong negotiating position to push back on that. So I think the question then becomes, like, what do you do with the rest of this leftover retail space? And I think the upside of that, again, this is where rethinking like what the neighborhood of the future is for, all of the things where the need for space is growing. And if we do enter a period where, like after the 1918 flu, the prevailing style of design starts to favor like a little bit more spacing out, a little bit more light and air, that space might become useful for new ways of thinking about schools, new ways of thinking about other kinds of like health and wellness type uses. You walk around like any big city today, there's about 50 times more gyms, spinning studios, and fitness businesses than there were 10 or 20 years ago.
Yoga.
Yeah, I mean, those kinds of things are going to want to be centrally located. They're going to use space. They'll probably want to use more space. And so, like, that cultural, entertainment, wellness function, education, learning function of the city can benefit from displacing, the pharmacies and the banks and the Payless shoe stores of the world. So again, I think there's opportunities from a transportation point of view. It creates opportunity to put things in a city that generate more round the clock traffic, right? So we get a little bit more leveling out of demand. We don't have to build so much infrastructure for the peak. There are activities that can get shifted around too, and that the providers, the venue operators, have their own built-in incentives to shift it around. So you can imagine neighborhoods where it's just a lot more constant humdrum of activity around the clock. That allows the transportation network to operate in a much smoother fashion. And with automated vehicles kind of constantly plugged in, you can squeeze out all the other inefficiencies that lead to congestion and make it hard for people to choose good modes and make other decisions that are good for them and good for all of us.
We know that cities are changing rapidly, urban places with higher densities, but you also put together a typology to look at some of those other spots too, kind of as an exercise in thinking about places outside of cities. I'm wondering how you came about putting together the transect.
Yeah, I mean, the transect is a popular tool that the new urbanists, really used effectively to help teach millions of people probably about density and why density is desirable and good. I actually came across it when I was researching the last book, Smart Cities, in its original form in urban planning when it was put forth by Patrick Geddes in Scotland when he was doing his diagrams of Edinburgh. He called it the valley section, and he used it to describe sort of the relationship between the city center and the periphery and the way technology had evolved to allow dense urban settlements. So it's an old idea, sort of slicing the city open like a tree and looking at the rings. And, I simplified it. The new urbanist had 6 zones. I just used 4. And really what I just wanted to do was give people a way of starting to approach this question of, does automated mobility favor concentration or dispersal? Because that's really the urban planning chapter of the book. And that's the question I think that's on urban planners' minds. Like, are we gearing up for another round of sprawl? Or is this something that we can actually harness to achieve the things we've been trying to achieve? Getting people to build and live in more compact, less energy intensive ways. And, I pretty decisively come down on the side that it is geared towards concentration. And that is the good side of financialization. The kind of most powerful argument you can make against sprawl is that it's expensive. It's really wasteful and inefficient. And by exposing, the distorted decisions of our transportation policy to more market force, we're going to get a lot of inequity if we don't correct for it. And that's kind of what I was trying to guard against, potentially some corruption. But we're also going to get a lot of efficiency. And efficiency is going to mean more distance pricing, more demand pricing, and any other pricing scheme that operators can come up with that we're willing to pay for. I think that's really where the fascinating stuff is going to come from. And I threw out like all kinds of crazy ideas in here. Like, it'll be possible to charge for like almost any kind of micro behavior in the transportation system. So, should cities charge more for left-hand turns into oncoming traffic? That is something that potentially could be regulated, right? You don't have to design it out of the built environment. You just put a rule in the code. Every time you want to make a left-hand turn into oncoming traffic, 50% surcharge. And the car will decide, well, if I drive around the block making 3 right turns, I'll get there a minute later, but, like that's the kind of thing that I think the financialization really will bring into the picture, which is this kind of ruthless quest for efficiency. And that will be good for cities. Proximity, reducing travel time, reducing travel costs. And if we can allow that to play out in a kind of observed, harnessed way, it could be really, really wonderful. If anybody follows me on Twitter, you may be thinking like, well, I'm listening to this guy and he sounds like he believes in, density and walkability. But I follow his Twitter account and he's like railing against like the 15-minute city and a lot of other ideas that I think are good. The reason is that I'm trying to understand how to future-proof these ideas. So, when I look at something like the 15-minute city, it's primarily focused around walkability, which I think is great. But then I also see the fact that, we're selling literally hundreds of thousands of electric bikes, and most of the young people I know have some kind of electric powered personal mobility device. So how do those technologies, those forms of mobility, which allow them to cover 5 times as much distance in the time that you or I walk to a transit stop, how is that going to affect, their ability and their decision-making process when they go to, choose the place to live or decide how to get from one place to another? And, in aggregate, how is that going to have an impact on the city? And do we need to maybe update our thinking a little bit and pull some of these ideas out of anchor that they have in like traditional urban form and address some of these trends?
Do you think cities will ever be able to, and this is kind of a hobby topic of mine, do you think cities will ever be able to create transportation as a public utility?
What sense do you mean it?
Well, I'm thinking of like regulating the streets, making sure that everybody has equal access, those types of things. We're talking about curb access, pricing, basically taking the ownership of the streets they already have rather than kind of getting pushed around, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's within reach for sure. Some of the things that are happening with mobility as a service, I think it is kind of orchestration, right? Of plugging together all these different systems behind the scenes, bike share, transit, car share, whatever the modes are that are available, whoever the operators are, private sector, public sector, and making that totally invisible to the end user and essentially just presenting them with choices that nudge them and create a lot of value for them, but also nudge them in ways that are, socially optimal. I think those are the demonstration projects that are going to show people the benefits of expanding that authority and expanding that integration and that orchestration of all those different pieces of the city. You know, every country, every jurisdiction is going to have its own weird historical anomalies that create roadblocks to that. And the US has more than its fair share of them. But I think automation is going to, again, the financialization piece is going to create pressure for accountability there. When US cities start seeing, say, Berlin or Paris recouping investments or avoiding building roadways or generating revenues for transit by taking these steps, or mayors getting reelected by pushing these kinds of policies, I think that will certainly make the case. And then when we see investors willing to come up and provide the capital to make things start to move and get deployed, that's when the resources will be there to pull it off.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have been inspired by Mayor Hidalgo in Paris and some of the other innovations that have happened, Jelby in Berlin and things like that. We'll see how effective they are. One of my last questions, I'm wondering what the response has been to the book.
I mean, so far it's been, enthusiastic. I think we're in a really weird time to launch a book.
I know it was written before all this, and then you kind of come into it, and it's not the best because you can't go and promote it. You can't
Yeah.
go out and shake hands and tell people a little bit more about it so they can get a hold of it. But fortunately, that's why we have podcasts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm excited by this opportunity to share it. One of the things I was happiest about was when the pandemic hit, I opened up the book. It was too late to change anything. And I looked at it and said, I wouldn't change anything, really. I think that the vision of the future that I had in there, particularly around the importance of focusing on freight, is only more pronounced. The one thing that I think is slightly derailed is that the sort of juggernaut of money going into automated vehicles seems to be sputtering.
Hmm.
It was already starting to sputter. As the people at Gartner Consulting say, automated driving had kind of hit the trough of disillusionment. They have this like S-shaped curve of tech adoption or tech hype, the hype cycle, that's what they call it. But after the trough of disillusionment, which is after the initial excitement, that's when the steady climb towards realization starts to happen. So, the forecast in the book is that it's not going to be passenger vehicles for consumers. It's going to be these hundreds of other specialized vehicles doing all kinds of things, primarily in cities. That's a good thing for us, and that we should get engaged and we should try to shape it, inspire it, and regulate it. That there's a lot more upside for cities than there is downside. I still feel that's the case. The one weird thing is around the dispersal. I don't think anybody could have predicted, and it's still, pretty limited, at least in the US at this point, to like New York and San Francisco, but the sort of speed with which really large numbers of people would flee the city.
Hmm.
I'm of the school that a lot of them are going to come back. They were able to go quickly because they were highly mobile. And as soon as it's safe, they'll be the first to sweep back in. But like how much of the distributed work culture remains and whether that sets up demand for a new round of like really kind of hyper sprawl.
Hmm.
And I did conjecture about this in the afterword to the book because the market would support it. If automated vehicles, like a Model T type Tesla made it easy for people to live, 3 hours out from Chicago in the Iowa cornfields, I think that the market for satellite towns in those kind of places would come together very quickly, especially if the pandemic continues to hang over us. And when I was doing the initial radio tour for the book, we had a lot of interviews with small towns, like all around the country, and people were super excited about that idea. And so, that's kind of like the American twist on the book. There might be like two different futures for the Ghost Road, right? One where it's robots doing all the great stuff to keep cities going in the middle of the night while we all sleep. And then another one where they're just sort of trucking across the open plain, driving people to satellite towns hundreds of miles into the hinterlands.
I like the city, and I like, escapes every once in a while to the country. I grew up in Texas, out in the suburbs, and I do appreciate that. But I think, you mentioned kind of being able to live somewhere far away and then what the cost of commuting would be. I don't know if I could live far away. I could do it for like vacations and stuff, and I love it when I do it, but I don't know if I could leave a city. It's interesting to kind of think about what your decision might be, and I think it depends on the person, really.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I put that part in the afterword was in a way to distance myself from a little bit. It was having a little bit of literary fun, a little bit of literary license there. Like that wasn't part of like the serious urban analyst there. That was a little bit of like my inner self trying to wrestle with like what I know is right and wanting to be in two places at once. And like, what does it mean that the technology may allow that to happen?
Yeah.
And, how do we make it clear to people like what those trade-offs are that are involved in those kind of choices?
Also, at the end of the book, and this is, I guess, my last comment, you said, you all go out and write books. You all go out and do some of this stuff. I'm guessing that means no third book for you.
I'm thinking about writing a novel, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, I'm gonna write some more for sure.
Oh, good. That's good to hear. I was worried. The book's so good. I was worried that you'd stop, but that's good. The book's called Ghost Road, Beyond the Driverless Car by Anthony Townsend. You can go to bookshop.org and get it, and it'll give some of the proceeds to your local bookstore. Where can folks find you online?
starcitygroup.us. That's my combined personal and consulting page that has like all my stuff from the last 20 years, as well as both the book pages are on there as well.
You mentioned your Twitter account. Do you want folks to follow on and see what you're talking about, whether you're, kind of poking people a little bit?
Yes, it's at Anthony Mobile, but it's totally uncensored. Tap straight to my brainstem. So be warned.
Fair enough. Well, Anthony, thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
And thanks for joining us. The Talking Headways podcast is a project of The Overhead Wire on the web at theoverheadwire.com. Sign up for a free trial of The Overhead Wire Daily, our 14-year-old Daily Cities news list by clicking the link at the top right of theoverheadwire.com. And please support the pod on patreon.com/theoverheadwire. Many thanks to our current patrons for their ongoing support. And as always, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Overcast, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. And you can always find a digital home at usa.streetsblog.org. See you next time at Talking Headways.